Okay, so we're in Romans chapter 2, continuing on our study of Romans. And as Jack said in the last study, when we see the word therefore, it's because it's a continuation of the conversation they were having in the previous chapter. And in chapter 1, Paul was addressing them about the fact that although they know God's just requirement that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do these things, but even applaud others who practice them. Let me share my screen. Okay. Dorothy, would you like to read down to verse 5, please?
Sure. Therefore, you have no excuse, every one of you who judges, for when you pass judgment on another person, you condemn yourself, since you, the judge, practice the very same thing. Now we know that God's judgment against those who act like this is based on truth. So when you, a mere man, pass judgment on those who practice these things, and then do them yourself, do you think you will escape God's judgment? Or are you unaware of his rich kindness, forbearance, and patience, that it is God's kindness that is leading you to repent? Because of your stubborn and unrepentant heart, you are reserving wrath for yourself on the day of wrath, when God's righteous judgment will be revealed.
Okay, so the point I believe the point he's trying to get across to them in these verses is to change your mind about the law. The law was given to point out imperfections, the fact that we sin. And if they wanted to continue to live by the law, they were going to be judged by the law. When we judge others, we are still trying to live by the law, right?
Right.
And Peter says in 1 Peter 4, 7 and 8 says, the end of all things is at hand. So it was at hand in that generation. Therefore, be self-controlled and sober-minded for the sake of your prayers. Above all, keep loving one another earnestly, since love covers a multitude of sin. So rather than judging, they were to cover each other in love, because to judge them was to live by the law, and if they lived by the law, they were going to be judged by the law. And Jesus tells us in Matthew 7, 1 and 2, he says, judge not, that you be not judged. For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. And Paul says in Galatians chapter 3, 10 through 12, for all who rely on the works of the law are under a curse. For it is written, cursed be everyone who does not abide by all things written in the book of the law to do them. Now it is evident that no one is justified before God by the law, for the righteous shall live by faith. But the law is not of faith, rather, the one who does them shall live by them. Meaning, if you're going to justify yourselves because you have the law or you keep the law, you better be keeping every jot and tittle. And for those listening online, I just wanted to establish when Jesus said his wrath would come and when he said he would return. It's not what we've been traditionally taught. In Matthew 24, 1 through 2, Dorothy or Jax, do you want to read it?
Sure. Matthew 24, 1 and 2 only?
1, 2, and 3.
Okay. Matthew 24, 1 through 3. As Jesus left the temple and was walking away, his disciples came to him to point out to him the temple buildings. But he told them, "You see all these things, don't you? I tell you with certainty, there isn't a single stone here that will be left standing on top of another. They will all be torn down." While Jesus was standing on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately and said, "Tell us, when will these things take place, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?"
Okay. So the whole theme of Matthew 24 is centered around the temple and what will happen at the end of the age, not the end of the world. It's the end of the old covenant age, as Luke confirms, which we all know this, but there's people that don't understand, because right now with everything going on in the world, everybody's thinking, listening to all the prophecy teachers and thinking that the coronavirus is the signs of the times. And Luke 21, 20 through 24 says, "And when you shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh." It's nigh in their day. "Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst of it depart out. And let not them that are in the countries enter thereinto. For these be the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled." All things, all Old Testament prophecies were fulfilled at that time. "But woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. For there shall be great distress in the land, and wrath upon this people." So it's talking about Old Covenant Jerusalem. "And they shall fall by the edge of the sword, and shall be led away captive into all nations," which means that it wasn't the end of the world. It was the end of that age. And some of them were led away captive into all nations. "And Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of Gentiles be fulfilled." So there are no more prophecies to be fulfilled according to verse 22. Is clear. All prophecies that were written in the Old Covenant were fulfilled at that time in that generation. And remember, this letter was written in 56 AD, so this is 14 years before that day when God's wrath would be poured out. Jerusalem be left desolate. And Jesus said in Matthew 10:23 that when they persecute you in one town, flee to the next. For truly I say to you, his disciples, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. So it was to happen in that generation. And this doesn't mean that wicked men will never try to self-fulfill the prophecies like we see happening in the world. But we can rest knowing that those of us in our generation, are not in the last days and do not have a day of judgment when God pours out his wrath in our future. What we see going on now is not God pouring out his wrath upon the world. That's not what's happening. It's evil men creating things and trying to make the prophecies be fulfilled. Those of us who know and believe the scriptures can truly enter into his rest and be at peace while the rest of the world is crumbling around us, because we know who is truly in control of world affairs, and that is Jesus Christ, our King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Our destiny is not to be enslaved. So even though we don't know what is going on behind the scenes, we have nothing to fear because our God has our back. But like Jesus tells us, we need to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. We need to ask for wisdom and discernment and learn to listen to his still small voice, not what the voices of the media and those in the world want us to believe. Comments?
Lisa, one of the things that I wanted to bring out is it says that not to judge that we be not judged. That doesn't mean that we're not to see where wickedness is and stay away from it, and that we're not to acknowledge where sin is. That's a judgment call, but to sit in judgment, the way people use it lots of times, means that you should kind of ignore what goes on around you. I just think that it's important to know that you have to be able to judge what's right and wrong.
Oh, I
Not
agree.
necessarily extricate yourself from everybody that's involved in it, but that you need to acknowledge and in that way judge what's right and wrong.
I agree. And that's
I think
discernment.
sometimes that text is
That's discernment that we discern, I think it's important to discern for sure. But like when you hear people, you guys better do this and you better do that because God's judging the world right now and things like that. Well, Jesus paid the penalty of our sin. And second of all, we don't want the world just coming to the Father because they're in fear of a judgment. He wants their heart. We don't serve God because we're afraid. We serve our God because he loves us, And so we should be careful not to be condemning those around us, but rather loving our neighbor, doing what we can to help our neighbor and show them the Father's love for them. But yeah, I agree, Doris.
right. I think that's nation, I think is the word.
What?
Without condemnation.
Right.
That's an
Yeah, and be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. So I think it's important not to, put our head in the sand either. We need to be aware, but we don't have to dwell on it, and we can rest, knowing that our Father is in complete control.
Hi, Kelly.
Good morning or afternoon for all of you.
Hi, Kelly.
Hi.
perspective. Hi, Kelly.
Hello.
We'll talk and chit chat after the study. I don't have a whole lot today, but do you have anything to share on what we just talked about?
I guess if we think of it as a conflict between two brothers and sisters that we love, if we're going to throw up our hands and say, well, I can't judge, then really we're allowing the person that's wronged to continue to be wronged and not have any vindication. I heard a commentary on this actually last week, and it was kind of an extreme example, but I guess that's kind of how we understand points the best when they're taken to an extreme, is if we had a friend that we knew was abusing their children and it was brought to light to us, if we're just going to throw up our hands and say, oh, that's not my place to judge, we're allowing that to continue, and that's not really standing up for God and what he allows. So
That
I do think
yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
no, that's basically it, that it does get misapplied and misused.
I agree.
But then on the same token, we can't say the person that was doing the abusing, we can't say, oh, that's it, you're written off as an evil person and that's the sum of your parts, and you're disposable. I think God wants to restore all, and that's the main message, really.
Amen. I agree. And that's where wisdom comes in, knowing
Mhm.
what to do in different situations. I guess where I'm talking about is like people you see on Facebook, condemning everybody, and it's like they're trying to live by the law,
Mhm.
you know.
But it's always things that they're not even tempted towards.
Right. Exactly.
I don't really see a movement of people condemning people that are busybodies or gossipers, but Paul had a lot to say about them.
Absolutely. That's for sure. Kelly, did you want to read starting with verse 6 through 10
Okay.
or through
Um,
11? Sorry.
oh, okay. For he will repay everyone according to what that person has done. Eternal life to those who strive for glory, honor, and immortality by patiently doing good, but wrath and fury for those who in their selfish pride refuse to believe the truth and practice wickedness instead. There will be suffering and anguish for every human being who practices doing evil, for Jews first and Greeks as well. But there will be glory, honor, and peace for everyone who practices doing good, initially for Jews, but also for Greeks as well, because God does not show partiality.
Okay. So he will repay everyone according to what he has done because they were coming out of the religion of works.
Mm-hmm.
And Revelation 22:12 says, "Behold, I am coming soon, bringing my recompense with me to repay each one for what he has done." And the word soon means shortly and without delay. So the point I'm trying to point out to people is they were pre-wrath. Judgment was getting to be was about to be poured out on them, and it was coming like in 14 years later from when this letter was written. So I'm just trying to, make those points as we go. They were under the law of Moses. It was a religion of works. They were going to receive their reward according to what they had done.
Lisa,
Yep. Go ahead.
this is where what I was looking at this week came in on where he will repay everyone according to what that person has done. In Psalms, it talks about, there are a lot of places that it talks about, but Psalms 139 says, "O Lord, you have searched me and know me. You know my sitting down and my rising up. You understand my thoughts afar. You comprehend my path and my lying down, and you're acquainted with all my ways." And then it says, "Where can I go from your spirit, or where can I flee from your presence?" Anyway, what I was impressed with this week was how intimately he knows every part of us and everything. And Nehemiah 9, the whole chapter is talking about how well he knows us and how, what's the word I'm looking for? How he can judge us, and he knows exactly what's going on in our lives. He knows there's nothing that we can hide from him. That's not what I wanted to say, but I can't think of the right word. But anyway, that's what came to me with this 2:6, for he will repay everyone according to what that person has done. He knows us intimately, and that's what we're judged on by him. I mean, that's what he can see. He knows where we are with all of this.
Right. But are we still being repaid? Are we still being judged? As far as the
Well,
wrath
all
of God.
our heart is, and that was the point I was trying to make. He knows what our heart is on all of these things. No, I don't think that we're still being judged.
Yeah. Jax, do you have anything to say?
This is where I was telling you earlier before we started about having to really pay attention to the audiences that Paul is speaking to. It took me a little digging, but when I finally got to through 5 through 8, and I realized that he's comparing the believers to the ones who are contentious and resisting the persuasion of his argument and position on the good news. And those that were contentious and resisting him were disdaining God's graciousness, his peace, and his glory through what Christ had done in bringing that peace. And so, again, as you were saying, there was a day when this was going to be dealt with, especially with those who were doing the contending. Now, this is where I keep thinking that part of what Paul is doing, he's not just addressing the church, but he's addressing the Jews in Rome who maybe are curious about this newfound group of people that are professing a similar religion. And he keeps injecting a little bit of talking to unbelievers here, because I don't think you can call the brethren who don't have hard hearts and say that they're the ones that are contentious and resisting persuasion. That would be a contradiction. So you have to kind of really dissect this and see who is he talking to, and which, it kind of goes back and forth. Is he talking just to the believers? Is he talking to, people outside of the community of believers? And I see this really as a comparison in the center of this, and would make sense because of that he wants them to know that how they're judging, how the outer community among the Jews is judging by law those who are the believers, that there's coming a day when this is going to get judged. And it's soon. It's nigh, as you said.
Amen. And as he says in Matthew 24, 21 and 22, he says, "For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been short, no human would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short." And we know the elect was those believing Jews of the first century. And so tribulation, the great tribulation, they were all coming into that. They were all beginning to feel the birth pains. So, and he says, from the beginning of the world and never will be. So I'm going to stand on that promise that, there's been tribulations and distresses in our world, but when you really do the research on what happened in AD 70, when it got so bad they were eating their own children and stuff, it was pretty bad. I don't think that it's never happened like that again in history since then. Do you guys think so? We haven't heard of how, and it was bad. After going through our study of Revelation, I realized how bad it was. And I don't think we've ever had it that bad since. But then again, there's the Holocaust. But still, it wasn't like what they went through.
Yeah, I think to speak to the issue about the Holocaust, because I know a lot of people will throw that up, right?
Yeah.
We're not considering the Holocaust. Well, the concentration camps were really bad. But the Germans did not allow cannibalism. And that's what we're talking about when you say that they turned to cannibalism in Jerusalem. Also, and I think this is important in our context of today, when people talk about, well, this is the judgment of today, what's going on with the virus, and they look at the president and they make all kinds of accusations and all that sort of thing and say this is end times. Well, I have to argue the point against that, because first of all, the president is not doing what John Levi did to Jerusalem in saying, burn all your stores of food and starve to death, basically. We don't have to agree with the current government on every point or whatever, but they are not trying to do the kind of destruction that was happening in Jerusalem, with a sort of self-annihilation of the people inside the city. It's just, I know people want to make parallels to that, and it's like, you really can't. Might not like what's going on and what the decisions are being made, but the parallels are just really not the same.
Good points. And the Father did not bring us here to die. He didn't bring us here for our children to die. We're living in the rest. And so I think we need to just trust him. He's got everything under control. That doesn't mean take a blind eye to what's going on either, because we're seeing some things that shouldn't be happening, but the Father's in control. And I believe that we're going to get past this. And
well, I don't know if you got a chance, Lisa, to read that article I posted on what happened in, what was it, the 2nd century, where there were these terrible plagues, and who shone through those plagues. Who, this is a test, and it's not necessarily should be viewed as some sort of end times thing. I mean, they could have done that in the 2nd century when they got hit by massive plagues. Just raised up their hands and said, oh, this is the end times and that's it, and don't care about anybody and God's coming tomorrow or whatever. But they didn't do that. The Christians went out and did exactly what we are instructed to do, and is to love your neighbor as yourself. And they went out and, in a sense, saved the culture, or saved the people that they could, where others were throwing people out into the streets. So, yeah, it's a trial right now, but we should be able to outshine those in the 2nd century, just from the sheer fact that we know more today than we ever have, and we have greater ability and capacity to help each other like never before, because of our advances in technology, for one thing.
And just knowing we're not in the last days brings peace and comfort, and we can bring peace and comfort to those around us, because if they're willing to listen, that we're not in the last days. Jesus isn't coming in our future. He's already here,
Well, one thing my husband just said was, we have unprecedented freedom. And I know there are people out there that say, oh, but the government's taking our freedom away. Oh, please go live in a communist country, please. Our unprecedented freedom gives us such great opportunity to show the face of God to other people. It's just, there is no limit. Only in our own minds and only through our own fear should we limit and put a basket over the light that we're supposed to be shining.
Amen.
And is it really appropriate for us to take the phrase great tribulation from Matthew 24:21 and apply it to any sort of trial? Wasn't this really specific to the theological group, or the not theological group, but the church at that time as a whole going through the Great Tribulation? And I know some people will apply this to missionaries, but even though missionaries are being killed in certain parts of the world, it's not all of us as a whole going through something. And because they were all located in the same geographical location, when now we're spread out across the world, I think that we could look at that passage and say it will never happen again in that way because we're not all in one same geographical location.
Great point. And like you said, it is misapplying that scripture when we try to bring it to every tribulation or distress that we go through. We're misapplying it because that was all about 70 AD.
Mm-hmm.
I just think there's always going to be an inevitability where people are persecuted or martyred when they're in places, as I wrote about and fulfilled, of areas of the world that are still kind of wrapped up in darkness. The irony that there are those that are persecuted, there's just as many people in those places that are not being persecuted.
Mm-hmm.
Carol's been posting some great articles from a great post from a guy in China who's a Baptist and over there doing a work, and they're not being persecuted. Matter of fact, the Chinese people love them and are helping them survive through the virus that's over there. And, you know, they're not being persecuted. So, yeah, we do see these events where certain situations where people are getting persecuted and martyred. Sometimes I think that may be due because of what they're preaching.
Mm-hmm.
If are they making the same mistake of saying, like the Zealots did in the first century, you know, we're going to overthrow the government. See, that would be a wrong kingdom message, and you can bet the Chinese would be all over that, rather than focusing on the spiritual kingdom and changing people individually, heart by heart. If you're preaching that kind of message in a communist country or a Muslim country, you can bet you're going to get persecuted for that because they're hearing the wrong message coming out of your mouth. It's not that you don't proclaim Christ as king. It's that you're proclaiming we're going to take over the world regime kind of message from a purely physical and flesh point of view, not a heart change point of view where you're to love your neighbor as yourself and you honor whatever government you're under, which is what the scripture says. Even if it's a communist or, you know, an atheist country, you're to have a good name among them. So it's a mixed bag as far as persecution, modern day persecution goes. And like Kelly said, this is not a worldwide thing, and it was a local thing even in the first century, and that's why it was so such specific language being used there.
Great points, ladies.
Can
Kelly?
I add something else? I just noticed, and maybe it's because of the version you have up, why I didn't notice it before. Verse 5, it does say reserving, well, let me read because of your stubborn and unrepentant heart, you are reserving wrath for yourself on the day of wrath. So
Right.
I just wonder if the judgment is more specific to the fact that the Jewish leaders were going to have their power stripped from them.
Yeah, see, Kelly, you caught what I caught there, and this is why I was telling you guys a little bit ago about pay attention to who Paul is switching back and forth of audience, because you can't call the Christians hardness and impertinent hearts, which is what my version says, and that they're treasuring up for themselves wrath. That's not talking about a Christian there.
Mm-hmm.
And when you go down to verse 8, you can see Paul again picks up who are these people that he's calling the you there. And to the ones of contention and resisting persuasion. The Christians aren't resisting persuasion. They believe in the Christ. So you got to watch these pronouns in here and pay attention to where he switches to talking to the Christian audience and where he's making a larger statement outside of those who are believing, which it's not easy to do, and it takes, you really got to slow down and read through this to catch. There are these very subtle switchbacks of who he's talking to. And I think in verse 7, is where we kind of have to start asking, or not verse 7, excuse me, verse 5, you have to kind of start asking, who is he talking to here? If these are believers in the truth, in Paul's gospel, if these are people who have been Christians for years, why is he calling them like they've got hardness of heart, and are contentious? Now, they may be having issues in the church between the Jews coming back from being expelled, coming back to a whole Gentile church. I get that. But I really feel here, he's talking to a much larger audience at times, not just believers. And so he wants that message of wrath soon to come to be talked about. But I just don't see that he's telling the Christians the wrath's going to come on you.
Yeah, I don't believe that he's talking about believers right there. Absolutely not.
Well,
That wouldn't make any sense at all, would it?
No, because once you've come to believe, you've passed. You will no longer be judged. What's that scripture? You've passed from death unto life, and you will not come into judgment. He's not talking to believers right there.
well, for my 2 cents worth, this is what I think at the very beginning. Therefore, when you see therefore, you need to see why it's there. What's it there for? He's talking about the chapter before, where he's talking about the Gentiles and what they were doing, that God gave them up to the uncleanness of their lust of their hearts. And that whole part was talking about the Gentiles to begin with. And then he comes up with the judgment thing. So I think that a lot of that, he's talking about the Gentiles and non-believers.
And
actually
the
think he's talking
Jews
about-
under law. Because the first section of chapter 2 here is he gets into the law. So he's covering all this gambit of people, like Dorothy just said, the Gentiles in chapter 1, those under the law in chapter 2, and neither one of those does he necessarily say, these are the believers I'm going after and telling you the wrath of God is coming. But he is kind of roping in everybody into this. Maybe as a way of cautioning even the believers, hey, don't get caught up in this, because that day of wrath is coming. But I can't see in 5 and 8 through 8 that this particular part anyway is referring to the person who really has a changed heart, who really is a follower of Christ, and whose sins are covered. Because then you're contradicting everything else that Paul talks about in other places, where God is not holding the believer under condemnation and wrath. So you have to try to figure out, who is he talking to, and where does he switch up these conversations, and how much of it is inclusive.
In verse 3, I think he's talking to his Jewish brethren, because he's saying, do you suppose, oh man, you who judge those who practice such things, because they're judging by the law, that you're going to escape the judgment of God? Or do you presume, because you're a Jew, that you're going to escape these things? You know what I mean?
Yeah, notice he didn't say you the believer. He says you the Jew, right? So Paul's got a broader audience going on here. And I thought about this morning. There's a video online by the University of Sagua. And the professor in that talks about something that happened in Corinth. And he made this very interesting statement or discussion about what would happen in the ancient world, as far as like, you would have a Roman house, and they were set up in such a way that in the day you could pass by the front of the house and look through into the area where there would be gatherings in sort of the center courtyard, and they would send people by. Jews would send people by, or outsiders would send people by, and they would spy in to see what was going on. So, and make a judgment about, well, what are these people doing, and then they would either report back to their leadership, the heads of the synagogues or whoever it might be, and say, oh, these people are doing this, these people are doing that. And I think in a sense here, this may be going on in Rome, where people are passing by maybe the Jewish leaders of the synagogue, and saying, oh, look at what these guys are talking about in these rooms, in these houses that we go by. And then making a judgment call, like, oh, I see that guy come out of there, and I heard what they said, and he goes and does this. And I mean, that's a great setup for someone under the law, taking what he's seeing and those person's actions and going, I'm going to judge you condemned. So it could be that kind of situation is going on here in Rome, like it was going on in Corinth, where people were spying out what was going on in the assemblies that were happening in the community of faith, and then going, well, we're going to judge you on whatever we see you doing when you're not there. I mean, it could be a situation like that.
Yeah.
The audience would be larger, because then Paul would be also addressing those that are spying out what's going on, and then using the law to judge those people.
Are these people that were sent to spy out, or even wanting to spy out, is their allegiance mostly to the Roman Empire?
It could be both. It could be to the Jewish synagogue leaders, because we know wherever Paul went, they tended to trail him and the followers to kind of chase him down, and like they would chase him into the marketplace or whatever after they chased him out of the synagogue. But it also could have been used as leverage against them to go back, or even other Romans to go back and say, oh, they're subverting. They're one of the arguments that the Jews often used was, they're trying to overthrow Rome, and so, yeah.
And the Zealots were.
Yep.
And the Zealots were, yeah. And so there was this element that they could kind of play off of, and not just the Jews. I mean, anybody that maybe opposed what was going on could say those things and bring up accusations. But because this chapter is about law in the beginning, I really think this is about people who are using the law, who may be doing the very things they're accusing the others of, by the way, and saying, well, we're going to condemn you for this. So we have to keep in mind that this particular area of this chapter, though, is really kind of dealing with this whole issue. If you judge by the law, you're going to be judged by the law, because you're doing these things too. So.
Well, and in verse 12, for all who have sinned without the law will also perish without the law. All who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law. He's addressing those Jews who feel they have special status and do not need to worry much because of their position. Paul shows specifically in verse 12 that there was no protection from God's wrath from the consequences of an evil heart just because you were a Jew. So change your mind about the law, because and don't expect the Gentiles aren't going to be judged by the law. They're going to be judged by whether their thoughts are excusing or accusing them in verse 15.
It could be too, Lisa, that under the when I forget which person it was who forced the Jews out of Rome, Christian or not, they were forced out of Rome. Could it be when they left Rome, they went back to communities that were mostly Jewish, in the sense that they were temple-centric, and they weren't believers, and maybe they had gotten overly influenced by that, and when they came back to a very Gentile church that still existed in Rome, that they were in pretty, kind of heavily influenced into conflict over the whole judging issue.
Yeah.
Both by the Gentiles, by the way, in the reverse, and because we do see that in this. But yeah, I don't know.
And one more thing I wanted to point out in verse 12 too is the word perish, because it's not spiritually speaking, it's physically speaking. It's all pointing to 70 AD when Jerusalem would be judged at that time. And people, when they see the word perish, they automatically think that it means going to hell to be tormented forever. We're 2,000 years removed and we have been taught wrong. We need to understand that these words, the way that they understood them we need to understand them the way they understood them in the first century. What did it mean to them? But people have a tendency to think the word perish, oh, they're going to perish, burn in eternal fire. And perish is a physical term for 70
Lisa, I have a question about that. Did you look that word up by any chance?
AD. No, you want me to pull up the Greek?
I got it here. Hold on.
I got it.
So it can mean destroy, die, lose, mar, perish. The reason why I asked is because I think sometimes we forget that when we do see words like this from a historical perspective, to be without a country was also a form of dying.
Very good.
If you weren't in the land, you were dead in that sense.
Yes, that's
Israel
it.
went into captivity to Babylon. That was as much of being in a state of deadness or perishing as it was as if they had actually physically died, but yet they didn't. Because to be cut off meant you didn't have life with God. So when this says, for as many as lawless sinned, lawless, I'm reading from the APB. Let me switch. For all who have sinned without law, who also perish without the law, and all who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law. That judging by the law can simply, and perish there, can simply just being dispelled from where you are, wherever that might be. You're going to be displaced. You're going to be sent among the nations, as we see in the Old Testament in the curses. When you went against God, you got dispersed. It wasn't always about physical death, and that's all I wanted to say about that.
Right, and that's a good point. I agree. Because some of them were cast out into the nations.
Right, and matter of fact, that was one of the things that gets even talked about in the New Testament, is that they would be dispersed, right?
Right.
That's part of Stephen's speech, St. Stephen, when he was giving his speech and recorded in Acts, and that was something that upset the religious leaders so much when he was making the point that land wasn't playing such a part of the new covenant, because they really held being present in the land was a big
Huge.
part of their salvation.
Yeah, for sure.
It's hard for us to put our frame of mind into how they understood things, because we've never been in that kind of position.
Good point, Kelly. And again, speaking to the whole issue is life and death was very much tied in their minds to the land. Mm-hmm. Everything was about the land. Your life, your inheritance forever was tied up in your land, and your perishing, or the lack of it, or your lack of prosperity was tied to the land. So if you were out of the land, that was as good as being dead to them. So yeah, it's kind of a broader aspect of what those things mean, but it is sort of in context with the times and how they understood it. And this is why Christ, who is eternal, heavenly, universal, makes the land, he's the peace, he's the Sabbath, he's all the things that they took for the physical, but in a spiritual reality.
He's our inheritance.
He's our inheritance, exactly. And that's our life, right?
Amen. Dorothy, do you want to read 13 through 18?
For it is not the hearers of the law who are righteous before God, but the doers of the law who will be justified. For when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them. On that day, when, according to my gospel, God judges the secrets of man by Jesus. But if you call yourself a Jew and rely on the law and boast in God, and know his will and approve what is excellent because you are instructed from the law. You want me to stop there in the middle of the sentence?
Go ahead. Keep reading.
And if you are sure that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of children, having in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth, then you who teach others, do you not teach yourself? While you preach against stealing, do you steal? And you who say that one must not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor breaking the law? You want me to stop there?
Okay, that works. And I was going to add, Paul is referring to the universality of the condemnation of sin of both Jews and Gentiles, condemnation for the Jews being under the law and its demands, the Gentiles being apart from the law and its demands. One question Paul answers in this verse is, how are the Gentiles who were apart from the law judged? And it says right there, their thoughts either excused them or accused them. And our day, we were never under the Mosaic law, but we were still under sin before we came to Christ. Just because we didn't have the law doesn't mean we weren't under sin, because the Gentiles, it says very clearly, they were under sin as well. That none was righteous. Both Jews and Greeks were under sin. So. Where did you leave off, Dorothy? I think we're in verse 23. Kelly, do you want to read?
How far do you want me to go?
Just go all the way, I guess, to the end.
Okay. You who boast in the law dishonor God by breaking the law. For as it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. For circumcision indeed is of value if you obey the law, but if you break the law, your circumcision becomes uncircumcision. So if a man who is uncircumcised keeps the precepts of the law, will not his uncircumcision be regarded as circumcision? Then he who is physically uncircumcised but keeps the law will condemn you who have the written code and circumcision but break the law. For no one is a Jew who is merely one outwardly, nor is circumcision outward and physical, but a Jew is one inwardly, and circumcision is a matter of the heart, but the Spirit, not by the letter. His praise is not from man, but from God.
Okay. if a Jew tries to justify himself by keeping the law, he better be keeping every jot and tittle, because if he breaks one, he breaks them all. The one who depends on the works of the law is going to be judged by the law, and they continue to break the law. Therefore, they brought themselves under the curses of Deuteronomy 28 and 30. It goes with us who are post 70 AD. If we think we have special status because we do all the right things that we deem necessary in order to be right, in order to be in right standing with God, then we also have fallen from grace. So we are either depending on our own works to be justified, or depend on the faithfulness of the Messiah and what he accomplished that justifies us. When we seek to be justified by what we do for God, we have fallen from grace. So to me, it boils down to two things: righteousness by our own works, or righteousness that comes because of the faithfulness of what Christ did for us. And the Jews thought, well, I already said that they have special status because they had the law. And Paul is saying it's not about keeping a set of rules that is going to save us from the wrath that was about to come, or that was going to save them from the wrath that was about to come. As it says in Romans 10:3, they were ignorant of the righteousness of God and sought to establish their own righteousness. So,
And when you mention a fall from grace, what do you understand the consequence to be?
like in our day, when we
Hmm.
fall from grace, good question. I think that my understanding previous or in the past has been when we fall from grace, we're
We're going to take our muck boots because it may be swampy and muddy.
Dorothy, you might want to mute. Fallen from grace. I think that probably we step outside of Christ. You know, that's a good question, because I'm learning, because of the stuff I'm learning now. Fallen from grace to me means you've become self-righteous and you've forgot who it is that accomplished the work that you are able to have to be in the position you're in. I don't know, what does it mean to you, Kelly?
I think I'm still in the process of untangling that also, but I think that's a really good point and a really good term, that we become self-righteous and not really living in the fact that God has done this for us and that he's the one that's poured out grace and mercy. And we become arrogant. And I think really what happens is we're not living life abundantly. We're not experiencing reciprocal love from other people. Instead, we're walking around with this self-righteous attitude, and that kind of cuts us off from
Grace.
everybody. Well, from grace and from just experiencing a connection and a love with other people.
Exactly. And that's how I see it too. And we become a Pharisee.
Mm-hmm.
And we're trying to live by the law.
Mm-hmm.
Because we're thinking that we have special status because all the right things that we're doing, and like you said, that's the word, I think, is he came to give us life abundantly, and we step outside of that. Not that we're not saved still,
Mm-hmm.
but we step outside of that when we could be living more in his fullness.
Right. I'll have to share. My daughter's church had an author last weekend. He wrote a book called What Made Jesus Mad? And he talked about the prodigal son. And I love how he presented it, and how the older brother always had the riches that his father bestowed on the younger son. And I think that's probably the best biblical example, is we could have everything, but because of our self-righteous attitude, we're not actually experiencing it all.
Excellent. And that's the perfect explanation. And it was always there for the prodigal son. He stepped out into wild living. He left. But when he came back, the father welcomed him with open arms, and he was back in grace.
Well, and he would have been happy to even eat with the pigs.
Yeah.
But the older brother didn't really come to the understanding of what he had.
And the older brother was like, well, why are you doing this for him? He's the one that left. I've done all the right things.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was kind of fallen from grace, because he thought he had special status by all the things, all the works he was doing to gain special status,
Mm-hmm.
when the father loved them both.
Right.
Yeah, that's a good example.
Do you want me to share that sermon?
Yes, if you have it with you, yes.
Yeah, I'll do that when we're done. It was good.
Oh, you can do it now if you want.
Oh, I'm not good at multitasking.
Oh, okay. Anybody else have anything to share? Okay.